Today is our fifth week of this series that we're doing on biblical justice. And last week I gave a recap of what we've covered so far up to this point. And then we looked at the Exodus. We did that to see what it might tell us about God's justice, God's character. And I highlighted two takeaways from that story. And the first takeaway is that the Exodus is the main event for the Israelites that defines God's character for them. So the Exodus shows them that God sees them, that God sees their suffering and the oppression that they're undergoing, and not just sees it, but cares and actually does something about it. And the Israelites hold on to this conviction about God's character throughout the entire biblical narrative, regardless of what is happening to them. They always hold on to this belief that God is inherently good, trustworthy, and cares about justice. And the second takeaway was that God draws people into this work of justice. So, for instance, God called Moses and his brother Aaron to serve as representatives. And these people that God calls are not necessarily who we would expect God to call. So Moses was not a skilled or articulate speaker. But for some reason, God chose him to confront the leader of a powerful kingdom. And we see that this is how God chooses to reveal God's power. And today we are continuing with this story after the Israelites have escaped from the Egyptians. And we're going to be asking, what does God's covenant with Israel and the law that God gives them reveal about God's justice? What do they tell us about how God works towards justice? So, like last week, I'll begin with a summary of the story. After the Israelites cross the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, God leads them through the wilderness, or the desert. And this is when some well-known stories happen. For example, this is when God sends them manna for the first time, that kind of bread-like substance that shows up in the morning. God also makes water gush out of a rock, so they have something to drink in the desert. And eventually, God leads the Israelites to the base of Mount Sinai. And God tells Moses to speak to the people, and this is what he tells Moses to say. This is Exodus 19, verses 4 through 8. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and if you keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. So Moses came, summoned the elders of the people, and set before them all these words that the Lord commanded him. The people all answered as one, everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do. So the Israelites agree to this relationship with God. They agree to obey God's voice and to keep this covenant. And once they agree, Moses travels up the mountain, and this is where God gives Moses the law. And the law begins with the 10 Commandments, and these commandments kind of serve as a summary of the law. So, no worshiping other gods, no stealing, no murder, etc. And then these principles are worked out in more detail in the rest of the law. In addition to that, there are also quite a few requirements related to how the tabernacle or the place of worship should be constructed. And Moses is on the mountain receiving this law from God for 40 days. But as these 40 days come to a close, God tells Moses that the Israelites have already broken the first commandment. They've asked Aaron to make them a golden calf because they want to worship something, because they don't know what happened to Moses. He's been gone 40 days. And so they make this calf and they worship it, and they take part in all sorts of revelry, which probably looked really bad. So Moses goes down the mountain. He's really angry. He breaks the tablets that the laws are written on. And he orders the sons of Levi, and this is the tribe of people who will become the priests, the Levites. Moses orders the Levites to go through the camp and to kill all the people who were worshiping this calf. Then Moses goes back up the mountain and he asks God to forgive the people, which is kind of a strange request because he already ordered them killed. And interestingly, God doesn't really say much about this event of the golden calf. Basically, God says that when the day comes, the people will be punished, but now they should just move on from Mount Sinai toward the land that was promised to them. Now, admittedly, this is not pleasant reading by any means, right? This mass killing at the end of the golden calf episode. It's very disturbing. And I'm pretty sure that we're going to be saying this over and over in this series, that these texts are full of disturbing stories, stories that might even strike us as the opposite of justice or the opposite of shalom or restoration. So, but zooming back out a little bit to this entire sequence of events, what can we say about this covenant that God initiates with the Israelites and the law that the Israelites agree to follow? The first thing that I notice about this covenant is that it reminds me of something that we noted in the Exodus story. And that is that God calls people to this work of restoring shalom. So just like Moses, the Israelites themselves are not necessarily who we would expect God to call or who we would expect God to favor. Why? Well, first, the Israelites were an enslaved people, right? So that's not exactly impressive in the ancient world. You would not expect to see God revealing God's self through a weak, enslaved people group. They're not wealthy. They don't have a strong military power. They don't even have their own place. They don't even have their own land, right? They are extremely vulnerable. The word Hebrew actually means wanderer. So they're vulnerable. And if God wanted to impress the world, this is not how we would expect it to happen. And that's the same dynamic that we saw with Moses, an unimpressive speaker who didn't actually even want this responsibility. But somehow, for some reason, God chooses them. And I think that the story of the golden calf kind of proves this point. It's not a great start to this covenant relationship, is it? Already, the Israelites have broken the very first, the most important commandment, right? Don't worship idols. You will have no other gods before me. We would expect God to choose a people who would embrace the law or who maybe would take to it naturally. But no, the Israelites are stubborn. Even after God has rescued them from Egypt, even after they witnessed the power and the spectacle of those plagues, after all of that, their faith and their loyalty still falter. And this is the people who God makes a covenant with, right? To reveal himself to the world. Such lofty hopes, right? I will make you a priestly nation, a holy kingdom. But based on the beginning of this relationship, my response was sort of like, good luck. You chose this people, good luck. But it's God's choice and it's God's plan to restore creation through this particular relationship, through this covenant with Israel. And the law is the structure for how this will happen. The law provides a structure for living out shalom in community. Now, as all of you probably know, the law has some truly disturbing elements, at least disturbing to our modern assumptions and our modern sensibilities. And, I just chose a couple that stuck out at the beginning of the law. So here's an example. Exodus 21, verse 17. Whoever curses their father or mother shall be put to death. Here's another that seems to be completely at odds with where the Israelites have just come from. This is Exodus 21:20. When a slave owner strikes a male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies, immediately the owner shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, there is no punishment because the slave is the owner's property. Now, are these the kinds of laws that are supposed to restore shalom? Honestly, I can't really see it. Now, in the book that I've referenced a couple times in this series called The Little Book of Biblical Justice, the author tries to address these disturbing aspects of the law, and especially the fact that there are so many infractions that are punishable by death. And his answer to this is that these laws probably were not meant to be enforced, which sounds very strange. But the word Torah literally means instruction. And so the law may have been used more as a teaching document, not so much as a rigid legal document. If it were used as to be followed by the letter, he writes that, well, it sounds like the streets in Israel would have been, filled with blood. Everything deserves death. But there are so many instances in the Old Testament where laws are broken and the people do not suffer this punishment that it's probably not correct to assume that the laws were actually enforced in the way that they're written. They're too vague to be used as legal document, and the penalties of death were probably meant to indicate more the importance of a particular code or law or principle. But just because there are disturbing parts, right? And honestly, things that might strike us even as evil in the law, it doesn't mean that we should discount it or overlook all of it. For example, one thing we see in the law, and we see in many other parts of Scripture, is that God shows partiality for disadvantaged people. We see this already in God's redemption of Israel in the Exodus, right? A people who had been enslaved. And we see this commitment in the law as well, particularly regarding 4 groups of people: widows, orphans, resident aliens or immigrants, and poor people. So, for example, this is Exodus 22, verses 21 through 24. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. Remember, punishment's probably not literal. But they were meant to indicate the importance of the principle. And according to this, widows, immigrants, orphans are extremely important to God's heart. Another example. This is Deuteronomy 24, 17 through 18. You shall not deprive a resident alien or an orphan of justice. You shall not take a widow's garment in pledge. Remember, you were a slave in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. Therefore, I command you to do this. So within this law that is meant to lead the people towards shalom, there is a strong partiality for the weak members of society, people who were vulnerable, people who were disadvantaged. And this reveals something about God's heart and about biblical justice. So honestly, I'm not going to get into much more of the details of the law. It's really long. And I'm going to stop here, and I want to reiterate a couple things. And the first is that this covenant between God and Israel is the relationship through which God is going to reveal his character to the world. That's God's intention. And we see this from the very beginning, right? The people immediately break the first, most important commandment. They build an idol and they worship it. And yet, God does not break his part of the agreement. Even though that would be completely within the bounds of this covenant, God still says, no, you messed up, but I am going to keep my part. I'm going to remain faithful to this relationship, even when you do not. And in the ancient world, that would have been seen as incredibly merciful. And secondly, the law is the way that God chooses to show them how to live together in shalom. And of course, like I said, there are many parts of the law that deeply disturb us, that might even seem evil to us. But it's not the whole story. The Mosaic Law is not a modern document. We should not expect it to conform to our modern expectations. And we also should not assume that it functioned like our modern laws. It was meant as a teaching document. And among other things, it reveals God's heart for the poor and for the disadvantaged. Thoughts, questions, concerns, disagreements. It's all fair game.
I've just never heard that idea that it's likely not like a literal legal document to be enforced, but to show the importance of the rule. I've just never heard that. So
yeah,
that's really interesting.
Yeah,
could change some of how you read those things.
Yeah, sure.
It's also interesting. I mean, you said our law and like not looking at it the same way, but in reality, our law is not fully enforced. Like there's lots of federal laws, like you can't serve margarine in a square format. It's federal crime to do that.
Oh,
And so like, there's crazy things out there that we don't even like realize or think about that aren't enforced. And I think we even have like a misunderstood perception of what the law is. That doesn't mean that those things aren't ever enforced, and I'm kind of curious like how following rulers or leaders would have interpreted this, because
right.
some of them could have been like, well, I want to kill these people, so I'm just going to use the law as my justification for it.
Right.
Which I think is interesting to even offer those breadcrumbs of legitimacy
Yeah.
to bad rulers.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and even if you think about, the book of Kings, how many of those kings worshipped idols? None of them were. I mean, I don't think any of them, well, I'm sure some of them were executed, but it's a bloodbath, honestly. Any other thoughts?
I wonder, in what you're talking about, when you say that it's meant as instruction and that, not, that God isn't going to, implement death sentences, et cetera, et cetera. And yet in a lot of cases, it seems like he does.
Right.
But it also seems that, to me anyway, it seems that when God doesn't implement a harsh penalty, that people feel justified in doing what they do, and they try to get away with what they can get away with.
Sure.
And I wonder about that. I wonder, just like you say, it's a teaching tool, and ultimately, in the end, people will receive
Some sort of judgment.
their judgment. Yeah, I mean, they will pay for their sins. Ultimately, everyone will pay for their sins. But it seems like that because justice is slow in coming sometimes, that people take
Right.
advantage.
Exactly. And like if yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, thanks for that. Did I see a hand over here somewhere? No. Okay. Oh, actually, that's what it was. I think I saw. Right. Okay. So Chris Senkler says, I have sometimes heard that the law was designed as a limit on the punishments that could be handed out rather than a minimum sentence, and that the judges had a lot of leeway in implementation. Thoughts? Yeah. And I have actually heard that too. So where where we hear an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that's maybe not a minimum requirement, but it means that punishment should be proportional. Like you're not going to kill somebody for maiming your eye or something like that. Yeah, thanks, Chris.